Hello. We are still reading Sidelights on Peking Life in the Beijing Postcards Historical Book Club. This book by Robert Swallow discusses Beijing in great detail. And in the very first chapter, then Robert Swallow, he's having a discussion with his teacher. And the teacher says, many people live in Peking, but there are few Pekingese. So today we will discuss, what does it mean to be a Beijinger? What is it that defines a person from Beijing? And in order to discuss this, we are now standing inside of the Dongfang Guangchang at Wangfujing. Because when this mall was built in the mid-1990s, you found something very interesting. Come with me. When this mall was constructed in the mid-1990s as one of the first modern Western-style malls in Beijing, you tore down all of the hutongs that was originally located right here, and you found something very interesting. Because right here, 20,000 years ago, you actually had several people living. You concluded that we were not only talking about a couple, it was a whole settlement. Because you found more than 2,000 utensils, as you can see here. And it was actually not the first time that you found things like this in this area. When you, in the 1970s, built the highest part of the Beijing Hotel, the same happened. So the thing is that these Beijing people here, we can almost call them the first Beijingers, or the first inhabitants in Beijing. And why would these people sort of decide to settle at this very spot? The reason for that was that to the north of the Hubei Plain, you had mountains. Just like today, you had a semicircle of mountains, and to the south of these stony obstacles, you had a vast plain. And this plain was perfect for hunting, you had water, and you could grow the land. And this was why you would have people in this area. When we go a little bit more than 2,000 years back, then we have the first time where these settlements are actually becoming so big so that we could call them a city. And when you say city in Chinese, you use the Chinese character cheng. And that literally means fortified enclosure. And from the moment you created a city wall, then you had a very strongly defined inside and outside. And in order to live inside of the city proper, you needed a permit. So from then on, it was very much this permit that decided whether or whether not you could call yourself a Beijinger. Beijing, the name, is not actually used till we get to the Ming Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty constructed Beijing 600 years ago, and the Ming Dynasty was actually the only Chinese dynasty to ever rule Beijing or China from Beijing. And they were also the ones that came up with the name Beijing, meaning northern capital. But when they were defeated by the last dynasty, the Qing dynasty, then the Manchus, they took over. And they took the Ming dynasty capital and divided it in two. In the northern part, you would have what was called the Manchu city. In this map, you call it the Tatar city. And that was because the Manchus, they lived in this area. They would push the civilians down south. So they would now live in the outer city, or the so-called Waicheng, that would now be termed the Chinese city. During these times, it did not only mean something whether or whether not you lived inside of the city walls. It meant a whole lot what city you belonged to. Because if you belonged to the Manchu city, the palace would provide for you. You would simply get money from the imperial government. That was not something that you could get as a Chinese civilian. But you had more freedom, because if you left the city as a Manchu, it would be seen as if you deserted the army. So during the Qing dynasty, you had a very strong segregation, almost apartheid-like segregation of the capital. But when Robert Swallow wrote his book in 1927, this had all come to an end. Beijing was now the capital of the Republic. And Robert Swallow is describing how Beijing is developing fast, and the prices of real estate are skyrocketing. But only a year after Robert Swallow wrote this book, in 1927, disaster happened to Beijing, because the capital was moved down to Nanjing. And this meant that for 20 years, Beijing would not develop very fast. The Japanese would come in, the nationalists also, but they would not really develop the city till we get to 1949. In 1949, the communists took over Beijing and would after a while decide to make Beijing capital again. The population would now grow from 2 million to 7 million in just around 10 years. The interesting thing here is that all of these people coming in, pretty much all of them were not originally from Beijing. Even great leaders like Zhou Enlai, Liu Shaoqi, and Mao Zedong himself, they were not Beijingers, but they would obviously now get the permit to stay inside Beijing. And this permit, the 户口 or the registration that defined you as a Beijing person, is still something that is very valuable today. Because if you have your registration as a Beijing person, then just like if you were a banner person during the Qing dynasty, then you will get the better welfare. So you could say that what defines a Beijing person is a bureaucratic registration. The ironic thing is obviously that this means that people that have stayed here for 30, 40 years, pretty much all of their lives sometimes, they are not registered as being Beijing people. So the easiest way of defining a Beijing person is actually not through culture, because the population and the cultures has changed over and over again. The definition of what it means to be from Beijing is actually a bureaucratic one.